Welcome to Crisis and Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into Ernest Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms. And, for decades, this book has been read primarily as a tragic love story set against the backdrop of war. Or maybe it's praised for its groundbreaking, minimalist literary style.
Right, and that framing, while it's completely valid in, say, a literature class, it actually hides the book's real powerful relevance for what we do here.
Yeah.
If we just put the romance to one side for a moment, what we uncover is this incredibly forensic analysis of institutional failure. The core systemic question this book is asking is profoundly modern.
Yeah.
So how does the vast, complex, often unexamined infrastructure of industrialized war transform people, even people not directly fighting, like our narrator Frederick Henry, into nothing more than expendable components of these massive, unfeeling bureaucratic systems?
And that's exactly why we're saying its importance goes so far beyond the personal stories. This book is a sustained, almost clinical examination of how modern institutions, particularly military ones, function to systematically drain meaning, moral clarity, and personal responsibility from the human experience.
Yeah.
Hemingway shows us a system where the process of war itself, the logistics, the paperwork that becomes the true protagonist, and the people, well, they're just resources. They're there to be consumed and then replaced.
So our mission statement for this deep dive is really to map that machine. We're going to focus strictly on the observable structures, the predictable patterns, and the underlying institutional logic that's depicted in the source material. We're completely avoiding personal advice. We're not talking about heroism in the traditional sense or making any moral judgments of Henry or Catherine.
Right. We're here to figure out what the rules of that system were.
Exactly. And how those rules applied pressure to the people trapped inside it.
Okay, so to really understand the system that Frederick Henry is operating in, we have to start with where it all came from. World War I. This conflict it was just not a conventional war in the sense that any previous war had been fought.
Right.
It was the first fully industrialized, truly systemic war in history. It was defined not by, grand strategy or these individual heroic acts, but by the relentless, monotonous, often tedious grind of logistics, material consumption, artillery, and motor transport.
And the novel just captures that shift from, let's say, the romance of war to the logistics of war perfectly. Hemingway doesn't give us glorious cavalry charges or tales of strategic genius. What he does is he documents the mechanical and the material weight of the conflict.
Yeah.
We see troops marching in the dust, we see the supply lines, and this constant movement of heavy equipment. He describes these big guns going past, but they're not being pulled by horses anymore. They're being pulled by these powerful new motor tractors.
It's the material density of it all that really sets the stage. Henry, who's an American serving as an officer at Tenente in the Italian ambulance service, he has a view of the system that is inherently logistical. It has to be.
His job is logistics.
His whole world is cars, routes, fuel, where the wounded are, and where they need to go. He's just a part of the supply chain.
There's that one powerful, really striking detail with the Italian troops' equipment. It just speaks volumes about this material burden. The description notes they're two leather cartridge boxes, heavy with clips of these thin, long 6.5 millimeter cartridges, and they're bulging forward under their capes.
And the line is,
They marched as though they were 6 months gone with child.
that image is so crucial because it instantly transforms the soldier. He's no longer this martial figure ready for battle. He's a carrier, a beast of burden. He's just burdened by the sheer unromantic material weight required by the administrative scale of modern warfare. You're not a person of high ideals. You are just a necessary component carrying the standardized ammunition required to feed the machine gun nests, even if the enemy is, miles and miles away.
He even redefines what courage is. Courage is no longer charging a hill. Courage is just continuing to march under the physical weight of the system's demands. And crucially, while Hemingway's own experience as an ambulance driver is, biographical context, its relevance here is purely structural. Henry is the narrator. He occupies that logistical role, that administrative position. He's a mid-level manager of materials and transport, and that gives him a perspective that's so much wider than the isolated, often mythologized, tunnel vision view of the frontline infantryman.
He sees the whole flow of the machine. He sees its operational reality.
And the chaos behind the orders.
Exactly. And this is vital because A Farewell to Arms came out of this widespread loss of faith in centralized authority that followed the Just the unprecedented scale of World War I casualties. The opening chapters, they very quickly establish a mood of systemic failure and this quiet horror where competence has just been replaced by inertia.
We see evidence of things going very badly, and it starts right from the top. There's that image of the king's motor car going very fast as he rushes to the front. It symbolizes the central authority just scrambling desperately to contain a disaster it can no longer control.
And then there's the failure of these repeated costly offensives. Henry just observes the mountains beyond the river and says they could not be taken. It's such a bland statement, but it hides thousands and thousands of dead men.
It's an administrative summary of a catastrophe.
It is. This institutional collapse wasn't sudden. It was a slow, grinding failure of competence and strategy.
And the horrors that are contained are stated with this chilling administrative precision, stripping away any human weight. Remember when the rain brought the cholera?
Ah!
7,000 men died of it in the army. And the official report concludes just flatly, it was checked.
It was checked. 7,000 men gone. Reduced to a footnote and a single word. That language choice is a perfect manifestation of the institutional mindset. The scale of death is just. It's normalized, it's sanitized by bureaucratic language.
It's a clinical report on maintaining operational hygiene. It's not a tragedy about human loss.
And that normalization is one of the most dangerous outputs of the whole system.
So this systematic detachment, it leads us directly to the central thesis of the novel, if we state it in the plainest language possible. The book fundamentally portrays war not as a test of character or a crucible where men find their mettle,
Right.
but as a rigid, impersonal system designed solely to consume individuals and resources while systematically refusing to accept or assign any form of accountability for its horrific outcomes. The system requires input men, material, and it produces output death, logistical failure, but its institutional logic just overrides any human consideration. The process itself becomes the ultimate priority.
It's a closed loop of consumption. And Henry, as an officer in a support role, he's just uniquely positioned to witness the mechanics of that loop from the inside.
Okay, so let's unpack this core systems analysis by looking at the specific institutional structures Henry interacts with. Let's start with the very nature of his job.
Well, the primary system at play here is military operation, but it's governed less by, battlefield dynamics and more by orders, strict procedures, and what we could call logistical inertia. The sheer weight of moving bodies and supplies becomes the overriding factor, and it masks any lack of genuine strategic purpose.
So the system's design is purely bureaucratic then. It demands procedural compliance and the maintenance of appearances, what Henry himself calls the false feeling of soldiering.
Exactly. And the outcome for the people inside is ultimately profound meaninglessness and the disposability of the human actors.
Let's dig into that idea of logistical inertia a little more. What do you mean by that?
It means the system is so large, so vast in its requirements, fuel, food, ammunition, replacement parts, that simply maintaining the flow becomes the central goal. The war continues because the infrastructure is too heavy to stop it, not because of some grand strategic goal.
And this is where it gets really interesting for Henry personally, right? His realization that he's actually irrelevant to it all.
It's a huge moment. He takes a long leave, and he returns to his ambulance section, and he admits that he had imagined the smooth functioning of the business depended largely on himself. He was the tenente, the American officer.
He had a sense of ownership.
He did. But what does he find when he gets back? The cars are moderately clean, the tires are checked, the parts are available, the operations are running smoothly, and his profound conclusion is, evidently, it did not matter whether I was there or not.
Wow.
That is the moment the system asserts its true identity. It is self-sustaining. The individual is interchangeable, disposable, and ultimately totally irrelevant to the machine's operation.
But doesn't that realization also kind of free him in a cynical way? If the system doesn't need his soul or his commitment, just his body and his compliance, then he can just go through the motions.
It's a structural freedom, absolutely. The incentive shifts from fighting for a cause to just pure procedural conformity. The system doesn't require belief, it requires attendance. We see how logistics dictates the entire conflict, overriding immediate needs. The offensive can only start not when the troops are ready, but when the new, wide road is finished.
And the detail about that road construction is so precise. It's all about traffic management, which is an intensely bureaucratic concern.
It is.
The plan specifies exactly how traffic should flow. Empty trucks go up the narrow road, loaded ones, including the ambulances, they come down the new road. The sheer focus on traffic management, even under shell fire, it just underscores that the operational design, the administrative blueprint, is far more critical than the supposed strategic purpose of the offensive itself.
They are fighting the war based on whether the roads can handle the flow of material. When you look at Henry's day-to-day life, it's not about fighting, it's about managing the resource flow. He's constantly drinking, traveling back and forth, eating the core activities of a logistical officer, making sure the machine is fed. This institutional reality creates meaninglessness, because if the goal is only traffic flow, why are men dying?
The system gives him no answer.
No answer at all. So he concludes the whole operation runs on autopilot, whether the participants believe in it or not.
And this procedural priority, it extends directly into the medical system, which you would assume exists purely for healing. But Hemingway reveals that hospitals are deeply embedded within the operational structure.
Yes. Their system design is fundamentally geared towards supporting the continuation of combat. It prioritizes institutional capacity over individual healing.
So the core incentive structure for the military medical system is to maximize bed capacity for the next operation.
Exactly. Which turns patients fundamentally into resources to be cycled back into the system or cleared out to make room for the incoming batch.
And what's the clearest evidence of that in the book? I mean, it's why Henry gets transferred to Milan in the first place, isn't it?
It is. It's not simply because Milan has better X-ray facilities, which he does need. It's explicitly stated that the field hospital needs the beds for the upcoming offensive. They have to clear the inventory of wounded men to prepare for the next inevitable wave of casualties.
The individual wound is secondary to the institutional need for space.
Totally. If Henry had a minor injury, he'd be treated quickly and sent back to the front. But since his leg is so badly wounded, he becomes a long-term liability on their ledger. So he's shipped off to a larger facility that can absorb his resource drain.
And we see that tension between institutional safety and patient needs play out so vividly in the Milan hospital when he's examined by those 3 consulting doctors. What's their advice?
Their approach is marked by this intense procedural caution. They recommend a lengthy waiting period, 6 months, for the projectile fragments to insist before they'll even attempt to operate. 6 months. They are prioritizing institutional safety and bureaucratic timeframes over the patient's immediate need to heal, get out of bed, and walk. 6 months is a safe bet, it's procedurally sound, and it minimizes liability for the doctors, but it's 6 months of Henry's life wasted.
It's the ultimate example of the system optimizing for itself, not for the human component. It says, we will prioritize a low-risk 6-month wait over a high-risk immediate fix, even if the immediate fix could restore the patient much faster.
And this institutional caution stands in such sharp contrast to the character of Dr. Valentini. He represents the competent individual existing outside the system's logic.
Right. Valentini's the one who actually fixes Henry's shattered leg.
He arrives, looks at the x-rays, declares tomorrow morning, not before, your stomach must be emptied, and he just operates immediately.
He embodies action, speed, skill. He ignores the 6-month rule. He is the independent, skilled actor who functions in spite of the bureaucracy, not because of it.
And his actions highlight a critical systemic conflict. The system requires the slow, safe, time-consuming path, because that path is auditable and repeatable across all levels of competence. The truly competent individual, like Valentini, ignores the procedure because they trust their skill. But that kind of individual competence is structurally dangerous to a bureaucracy.
Yeah, it undermines the need for standardized rules and paperwork.
Exactly.
That raises a huge point. If the goal is maximum efficiency and accountability across thousands of doctors, you have to prioritize the system that protects against the worst doctor, not the one that empowers the best one.
Right. The system rejects Valentini's brilliance in favor of the 3 consulting doctors' safety protocol.
Okay, so how does a system that is so transparently meaningless and self-serving, like the one Henry is in, convince millions of men to keep feeding themselves into the machine?
It requires abstract narratives. It needs words like honor, duty, fatherland to keep the human replacement feedback loop functioning. The incentive here is total, unquestioning loyalty to the narrative itself.
And the outcome, for anyone capable of critical thought like Henry, is this profound emotional and intellectual alienation. He reaches a breaking point where the required institutional vocabulary is just. It's actively poisonous to him.
Henry explicitly tells us this. He says that abstract words like sacred, glorious, and sacrifice, and the expression in vain, become embarrassing, flat, and ultimately obscene when he compares them to the concrete dignity of place names and dates. This is the collapse of institutional language.
And why are they obscene? It's because the words are just empty of the reality they claim to describe, right?
Completely empty. They're rhetorical masks used by people far from the fighting to justify the slaughter of men who are only concerned with immediate physical reality dust, rain, cold, food. The required vocabulary of the state becomes morally toxic because it's trying to justify an unjustifiable, murderous machine.
And the system actively rewards and promotes those who embrace this abstract language. I'm thinking of Ettore, the legitimate hero in the Milan hospital.
Oh yeah, Ettore. He's constantly boasting about his 3 silver medals, his 3 bad wounds, and how he's going to be a captain for merit of war.
He's structurally successful. He conforms perfectly to the system's preferred narrative of selfless, medal-chasing courage, even though, as Henry notes, he bores everyone he met.
He's the ideal product of the system, successful, decorated, and entirely devoid of interesting thought or genuine empathy. He's a walking public service announcement for the war effort.
And then on the other side, you have the enlisted men Henry interacts with, the ambulance drivers, like Manera and Pacini. They're completely alienated.
Totally. They're mechanics, socialists, anarchists. They view the war as stupid and pointless. Their discussions reveal the institutional fear of mass disengagement. Manera says it bluntly, if everybody would not attack, the war would be over.
And that isn't just venting, it's a systemic critique. Pacini points out that the common man is being forced to fight because they were beaten when they took them from their farms. It reinforces the reality that the war is maintained by coercion and threats, not by patriotic consent.
They even talk about the practice of summary execution, that chilling story of the granatieri who wouldn't attack, where the carabinieri shot every 10th man. The soldiers know exactly what the system needs to maintain compliance. Fear.
Right.
Pacini is clear. The reason men attack isn't patriotism. It's the fear of what will happen to their families. They'll lose their civil rights. They'll be without law.
So the system maintains this narrative loyalty, not through inspiration or genuine belief in honor, but through threats to the social and civil status of an individual's family. You fight to protect your mother's pension, not the sacred ground of the fatherland.
That is the true engine of compliance.
So if the system is a machine, then the bureaucracy assumes compliance, and it views any personal agency, any attempt to manipulate the rules for your own benefit, as a malfunction that has to be criminalized and corrected.
Yes. And yet we see individuals constantly trying to work the system, manipulating the rules of the bureaucracy just to survive. There's that episode of the sergeant who purposefully threw away his trust to worsen his rupture.
Right. He was hoping the resulting hernia would get him a medical discharge and save him from the line.
That is administrative manipulation in its purest form. He is using a loophole in the medical documentation system to achieve personal safety. Henry, who understands the system's logic, tries to do something similar by setting up a fake head injury for himself to get convalescent leave. He gets that a compelling narrative of injury is required to exit the war, even temporarily.
But the true nature of institutional logic, its brutal efficiency, that's really revealed during the chaotic retreat at Caporetto. When Henry is separated from his unit and he's walking along the road with Piani, they run into the battle police and the carabinieri setting up a checkpoint.
And this checkpoint is the system's emergency response to failure. They are executing officers who've been separated from their troops, branding them as agitators or traitors. This is the system's self-corrective measure. It's restoring control through rigid, lethal accountability.
It's like the military equivalent of a government declaring a state of emergency to seize assets.
Exactly. And Henry's desertion is triggered not by some moment of abstract philosophical rejection, but by a physical act of systemic violation. The carabinier grabs his collar.
That's the moment.
That's the moment. Henry realizes instantly that he is through, and that his obligation ceased the moment the coercive force of the state was applied illegally. He is no longer part of the contract because the state broke its own rules by falsely arresting and threatening him.
It's such a calculated, legalistic, and incredibly cold decision. He doesn't run screaming in panic. He makes a separate peace based on a transactional assessment of risk. And then he views his personal loss, his cars, and his men through this explicitly organizational metaphor.
The floor walker analogy.
Yeah. You had lost your cars, and your men as a floor walker loses the stock of his department in a fire. There was, however, no insurance.
Let's stop on that for a second. That analogy is so jarringly modern. He's assessing his material and human inventory loss in terms of corporate risk. So what does the lack of insurance imply?
Well, it implies that in this vast system, responsibility is just diffused until it rests nowhere, right? Henry, the manager, is responsible for the loss, but there's no overarching mechanism, no insurance policy, no governmental compensation that recognizes the validity of that loss or offers any recourse. The individual carries the burden, while the structure itself feels no pain and offers no remedy.
And because there's no insurance, there's no continuing obligation to the company. The moment the system tries to eliminate him, Henry concludes he's free to make a clean break. His final act is a calculated exit from the jurisdiction of a defunct and hostile system, symbolized by him literally jumping into the river and washing away the obligation.
Okay, so given that the external system, the military, the state, is totalizing, meaningless, and potentially lethal, the only possible emotional and psychological escape is an equally totalizing personal withdrawal.
Right. Relationships become these temporary shelters, and they're deeply intense because they have to mutually exclude the threatening external world. This creates a very pressurized, fragile incentive structure, which is deep mutual commitment. We see Catherine's plea to Henry, "Don't think about me when I'm not here."
And that's more than just a romantic request. It's a rule designed to protect the fragile space they've carved out.
It is. If Henry thinks about the outside world, he brings the system, the war, the risk, the bureaucracy into their shelter.
Their relationship starts, notably, as a coping mechanism, almost a distraction. Henry notes that their early interactions were a game like bridge where you said things instead of playing cards.
Which highlights the necessary artificiality and pretense required to navigate the emotional trauma. They're using the relationship as a controlled environment to practice feeling safe again, because the outside world offers no control whatsoever.
And Catherine is the one who really articulates the constant threat when she says, if anything comes between us, we're gone, and then they have us. Their happiness is it's so precarious. It's entirely dependent on maintaining a closed circle against this omnipresent machine.
Any intrusion, a military order, a medical diagnosis, an arrest, it just destroys their world and throws them back into the system's crushing jurisdiction.
So their eventual flight to Switzerland is the ultimate spatial and emotional attempt to exit the system's jurisdiction, their separate piece. They're trying to achieve a physical separation that mirrors their emotional withdrawal from the war's abstract demands.
But even in Switzerland, that feeling persists. When Henry realizes he might be arrested because he deserted, he notes, "I wished we did not always have to live like criminals." The shadow of institutional power is long. Even when you escape the war's physical location, you can't escape its legal and psychological jurisdiction.
They've achieved personal happiness, but they are constantly looking over their shoulders, knowing the system could reclaim them at any moment.
The system has succeeded in criminalizing independence. To achieve agency, they had to break the law, which means they are never truly free from the system's threat.
Okay, so we've broken down the component parts. Let's try to explicitly map the system of industrialized warfare and bureaucracy as Hemingway portrays it. What are the key moving parts?
We can break the system down by, let's say, actors, incentives, narratives, and feedback loops.
All right, let's start with the actors, the players moving inside the structure.
Okay, so first you have your soldiers and drivers, Henry, Piani, Imo, Bonello. These are the logistical components, the cannon fodder. They're increasingly aware of their systemic exploitation, which leads to cynicism and disengagement. They manage the flow of material, but they are material themselves.
Then you have the officers, like the Major or Captain Rinaldi.
Exactly. They're the middle management. They operate under immense systemic pressures. Rinaldi is burning out from overwork and cynicism, constantly drinking and joking to mask his despair. The Major is always worrying about orders and accountability to his superiors. They're not policymakers, they're just executors.
And the medical staff. Miss Van Kampen, Dr. Valentini.
Right. They function as gatekeepers and maintainers. They're caught between these strict bureaucratic rules, that's Van Kampen and the three consulting doctors, and the demands of individual competence, which is Valentini. They determine who stays in the system and who gets processed out.
You also have civilians, like the peasants or Emilio the barman.
Right. They're the collateral damage, the observers or opportunists. They provide temporary shelter, like Emilio rowing them across the lake, or they sell supplies and papers. They are outside the formal military structure, but they're deeply affected by its failure.
And finally, at the top, you have the state. The king, the generals, the battle police, the carabinieri.
Yeah, this is the central coercive and ordering authority. They dictate policy, they enforce control, and they hold the ultimate power of life and death.
So we have the actors.
Hmm.
What are the incentives that keep them moving, given that the war is so obviously pointless to so many of them?
Well, first is just obedience and conformity. This is the baseline requirement for junior ranks and logistical personnel, like Henry's initial compliance. You follow the traffic plan, you avoid being shot. It's simple.
And underneath that is just raw survival.
The primary motivator for the enlisted men, yes, it drives behaviors like the hernia patient's administrative manipulation or the driver's anarchism. The system rewards survival, but only through conformity.
Then there's procedural compliance.
Demonstrated by institutional actors, like those doctors who refuse to operate immediately. They prioritize protecting the institution from liability over the immediate benefit to the individual patient.
And finally, narrative, loyalty, and advancement. That's your editor.
Exactly. He conforms to the heroic ideal to secure promotions and medals. The system has to create these visible winners to reinforce the possibility of success within its structure.
And to maintain those incentives, the system relies on specific narratives, the ones Henry finds so false.
Right. First, honor, duty, sacrifice. These are the abstract terms that are structurally necessary. If the war is just about traffic flow, nobody fights. These abstract terms have to be constantly broadcast to justify the massive human cost.
Then there's the narrative of inevitability.
The belief that the war must go on, regardless of cost. The idea, stated by that British major, that the last country to realize they were cooked would win the war. This narrative just justifies perpetual fighting and maintains that logistical inertia we talked about.
And you need an enemy. The enemy threat.
Which is the necessary externalization of failure. It's used by the coercive elements, specifically the battle police, to justify the summary executions of officers and perceived agitators. They're claiming to protect the sacred soil of the fatherland.
Okay, now let's get to the most frightening part of this machine. How does it maintain itself when the structure visibly collapses during the retreat? What are the feedback loops it uses to reset and continue?
The system uses 3 powerful, interconnected feedback loops to persist despite catastrophic failure. First is the material loop. Cars are lost, Henry loses 3 ambulances and his men, but logistics keep sending parts, fuel, and replacement drivers. The system just keeps moving, which confirms Henry's earlier observation that individual loss does not stop the overall flow.
So the system is built in redundancy for materia.
Precisely. Second is the human loop. Wounded men are cleared quickly, the Milan beds must be made for the offensive, and dead men are instantly replaced. The executions deter mass disengagement. It's just a continuous churn.
And the third loop, the most brutal one, is summary execution. This is the immediate brutal enforcement mechanism when centralized command fails, like at Caporetto.
The battle police enforce the absolute necessity of centralized command and obedience during a retreat, and that's how they restore systemic control. They don't care about guilt or innocence or even rank. They care only about enforcing the structure of command through lethal demonstration. And they operate with, quote, beautiful detachment and devotion to stern justice of men dealing in death without being in any danger of it.
That phrase, dealing in death without being in any danger of it, it just perfectly encapsulates the distance between the policymaker and the consequence.
It does. The system persists despite visible failures. The disastrous retreat, the massive casualties, because the actors with coercive power, the battle police, enforce the necessary accountability through execution to prevent widespread, organized disengagement.
And Henry's desertion, swimming away from the illegal act of the carabinier grabbing his collar, that's his calculated systemic move. He is no longer under obligation once the coercive force has applied an illegal punishment.
The contract is voided and he leaves the jurisdiction. The system persists because most people, unlike Henry, don't calculate their way out. They are either killed or they comply out of fear.
So the structural logic that's exposed in A Farewell to Arms, this totalizing, self-preserving bureaucracy that consumes its actors, it's not unique to World War I or to military institutions. It's a recurring pattern in any large modern system.
Absolutely. Think back to Henry's floor walker analogy. Losing stock in a fire with no insurance. This perfectly illustrates the modern phenomenon of systemic responsibility being diffused until it rests nowhere. When a major systemic failure occurs in modern corporate or governmental structures, a massive data breach, an environmental disaster, a financial crisis, the accountability often just dissipates up the chain of command.
Right.
The organization suffers a monetary or reputational loss, but no single high-level individual is held accountable, and the component actors, the employees or customers, are left without recourse.
We have all seen this. A giant corporate merger fails, billions are lost. But the CEOs who design the deal, they just move on with golden parachutes, citing market conditions or unexpected external pressures. The system shrugs, reallocates the resources, and just continues its inertial existence.
And if we look specifically at crisis management systems today, the book's portrayal of the medical system is chillingly relevant. Prioritizing institutional image and capacity over immediate patient care, that 6-month waiting period recommended by the procedural doctors, it just mirrors failures in modern crisis organizations.
We see this so often in large-scale emergencies where procedure and paperwork become a defense mechanism against liability, even if they delay urgent solutions. The system is overwhelmed by scale, so adherence to protocol becomes a substitute for actual problem solving.
It's safer for the administrator to stick to the rulebook than to empower a Dr. Valentini to improvise and save lives quickly. The institutional logic will always prioritize self-preservation and the protection of that rulebook. We see this brilliantly exposed in the confrontation between Henry and Miss Van Kampen, the hospital superintendent in Milan.
She discovers his cache of empty brandy bottles.
And she immediately accuses him of faking his illness, simulating jaundice with alcohol, specifically to avoid returning to the front and to get convalescent leave.
Her primary concern isn't Henry's health, or even the truth of his condition. Her goal is to enforce procedural rules and maintain the hospital's image of operational control.
Right. She believes self-inflicted jaundice does not entitle him to leave. She is more focused on penalizing him for perceived nonconformity, for trying to work the system, than providing medical care or acknowledging the reality of his trauma.
It's the system policing its borders. She views Henry's attempt to self-medicate or manipulate the system as a violation of the institutional contract. She is prioritizing the organizational structure over truth or human context.
And that pattern, where administrative priority replaces genuine care or truth, is visible in any large organization that distances decision-makers from human consequences, using hollow language and procedural mechanisms to justify mass suffering and maintain a facade of order. The scale of the organization allows it to abstract away the results. The specific context changes. It might be a corporate restructuring today, or a wartime logistics plan then, but the structural impulse to protect the institution, even at the expense of its people, remains consistent.
This book, maybe more directly than any other we've analyzed, just directly addresses the core themes of crisis and perception. It fundamentally alters how we should perceive the actions of individuals inside massive systems.
It does that by deflecting individual heroism and individual blame. Henry is not a hero, but he's not a villain either. He is simply an observer and a participant who is trying to survive. By removing that individual moral judgment, Hemingway forces us, the reader, to examine the system itself, the coercive mechanisms that create the moral anarchy we see in the drivers who shoot the sergeant and then joke about it later in confession.
They aren't just bad men. They are products of the system's broken moral compass.
The machine has taught them that life is cheap and conformity is the only survival mechanism. They internalize the system's amorality.
So the core crisis of perception is explicitly defined by Henry's struggle between institutional narratives and concrete reality. The system requires the use of that abstract, inflated, obscene language, duty, honor, glory, to dictate what is acceptable thought and emotion. If you accept the language, you accept the mechanism.
But Henry intellectually rebels. His survival depends on separating the real from the fake. He trusts the concrete names of villages, the numbers of roads, the names of rivers, the numbers of regiments, and the dates because they have dignity and reality. Everything else is a lie that's used to justify the slaughter.
That separation, trusting the physical map over the political map, that is the very definition of a crisis in perception. It's realizing that the official story is a carefully crafted mechanism of control, and that truth has to be sought in verifiable, tangible details.
And finally, when the system proves utterly untrustworthy, as it does in the retreat chaos and the unjust executions by the battle police, all foundational beliefs just collapse. There is no longer a moral structure, no intellectual reason to remain.
So Henry's moral foundation, his intellectual life, it simplifies entirely to immediate sensory reality.
The system failed, meaning collapsed, leaving only pure, immediate survival. He famously concludes, "I was not made to think, I was made to eat, my God, yes, eat and drink and sleep with Catherine." When the institution fails, the individual is stripped back to their biological essentials, seeking only pleasure and safety in the face of annihilation.
He strips away all the abstracts, honor, duty, future plans, and he clings only to the sensory and the immediate, food, drink, and the total shelter of Catherine's presence. That extreme simplification is the ultimate sign of institutional burnout.
So what does a farewell to arms help us see differently about the world and the vast systems we inhabit today?
Well, it fundamentally reframes war for the industrial age. It is not a stage for human glory or national struggle. It is a machine of logistics and administrative murder, a vast, costly operation managed by motor trucks, doctors prioritizing bed space, and police ensuring compliance through execution.
It reveals the true nature of authority within centralized systems. Authority is maintained not through justice or morality, but through rigid, often arbitrary force, the carabinieri, the battle police, and through bureaucratic inertia, epitomized by the time-wasting advice of those three consulting doctors in Milan. It persists because the cost of challenging it is just too high.
And maybe most importantly, it forces a reflection on human agency. Individual integrity, sincerity, it cannot stop the institutional logic. If you are good, the system will break you. True agency within such a hostile structural reality lies only in achieving a calculated, deliberate, and often criminal withdrawal from the system's jurisdiction, seeking a separate peace in a world outside its control.
The novel's final, provocative thought builds on this cynical reality, and it leaves us with a question about compromise and destiny. The system ultimately breaks those who are truly good or brave, killing them impartially. But if you are none of these, if you're indifferent or just a survivor like Henry, the system will still kill you, but there will be no special hurry.
Which forces us to reflect on the nature of courage, compromise, and the inevitability of confrontation with a structurally hostile world. Is Henry's final survival a victory, or is it simply the system postponing his end? We've been deep diving into the systemic analysis offered by Ernest Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms. We highly encourage you to read the book or borrow it from your local library.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis and Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.